Samsung owns all.
Samsung owns all.
Power abuse scandal.
Corruption scandal.
In 2017, millions of people marched through the streets to take down their own government.
Protesters have turned
Yet another protest.
Protesting.
Because Samsung managed to get the president to betray her own people.
I'm so sorry.
In South Korea, a Samsung isn't just a phone you carry. It's the apartment you live in, your job, and even the hospital you were born in. With Samsung alone taking up nearly a quarter of South Korea's entire economy. But guess what? Samsung is only one of a few companies that run the nation. These giant family-run empires dominate the economy, influence politics, and shape everyone's daily life. With these four combined holding over half of the country's total GDP, they're called chaebols. And for decades, they've held extraordinary power over the nation. But today, they're said to hold too much power.
The difficult healing process begins in Ansan, South Korea.
But I wanted to know exactly how and why South Korea managed to let Samsung and the other chaebols take over the nation. So I did some digging and decided to break this video down into 3 sections, with the events and scandals that took place leading up to the final Samsung blow causing the country to erupt, with the names of each of the companies responsible for the build-up to Samsung's biggest catastrophe revealed at the end. But first, we need to know how it all began. So, I'm about to tell you something controversial. South Korea is actually supposed to be poor. Okay, hear me out, let me explain. Geographically speaking, South Korea is tiny, a similar size to Portugal to be exact. But the difference between them is that South Korea is not naturally economically productive in any department really. Only 22% of South Korea's land is arable, which means can grow crops. And to make things worse, South Korea also has very little coal and ranks 46th place for the amount of coal a country has in the world, which for the record is actually lower than its notorious neighbor, North Korea, who, as we all know, isn't exactly known to be the richest country. But what's most shocking is South Korea ranks dead last for the amount of oil reserves a country has in the world. So after looking at these statistics, you can't help but ask the question, how did South Korea get so rich in the first place? The year is 1938. A small grocery store was just opened by a man named Lee Byung-shul. It would sell locally produced Korean food consisting of mostly fruit and noodles. However, Lee always saw a much bigger vision for the company, more than just selling groceries. The Korean War had just finished, and because of this, the company was relying on imported goods. Lee thought,
This is not reliable. I must diversify the business to produce different types of goods.
with this newfound money from the grocery store, Lee decided to build a sugar refinery and the largest woolen mill in the country to start producing clothing, which luckily for him, became a success. So Lee decided to go even bigger with his ideas. So he opened up a whole department store and insurance business, which for the record are very expensive businesses to start. To this day, some of the branches of Lee's company are some of the largest in their respective industries in South Korea, which would soon make Lee the richest man in the whole country. This Lee that I speak about is the founder of what we know today as a company called Samsung, and this was its come-up story. From a small imported food store to a global conglomerate in every industry imaginable, Samsung is sort of like Korea's BlackRock, one company that just owns everything. Every industry known imaginable, Samsung has dipped their toes into. One company that dominates everything. But all of Lee's entrepreneurial success that he had achieved so far was nothing compared to what he was about to embark on: electronics. In 1969, Samsung Electronics was fully set up and running, and they released their very first product. And what was it? This 12-inch black and white television. By today's standard, it doesn't look like much, but at the time, this was revolutionary. Samsung would then go on to become #1 in the world for black and white TV manufacturers, and soon, one of the leaders in the global electronics market. But one thing to note, Samsung's dominance at this point wasn't exactly seen as a bad thing. A company that finally put South Korea on the global map, taking the country out the dark place it was after the Korean War. You're probably thinking, how could that be a bad thing? Well, the disasters, scandals, and shady practices that I cover at the end of the video hadn't quite started yet. At this point, Samsung was seen as the golden boy that could do nothing wrong, the poster head for South Korea, spreading South Korea's relevance to the entire world, leading us on to my personal favorite part about South Korea's rise, the stranger industries Samsung has been involved in. Did you know Samsung specializes in making giant ships? And guess what? They are one of the largest manufacturers of ships in the world. I had no idea this existed before I started researching for this video. Next, we have Samsung C&T, one of the largest companies in the world where they build public infrastructure, making roads, tunnels, and buildings. And by no surprise, Samsung is leading that industry too. But the most fascinating part about Samsung's involvement in this industry is that Samsung actually built the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world. But back to Korea, where Samsung also have their own hotels, theme parks, and even owning a whole Samsung town. But chaebols are not all sunshine and rainbows. The story is about to get dark. Wednesday 16, 2014. An emergency dispatcher receives a call from a child at sea. It's soon identified as being from the Sewol ferry on a routine trip towards Jeju Island, with the ferry mostly filled with women and children. The dispatcher begs the child to put the captain on the phone.
If the ship is sinking, why didn't you call us?
Immense panic breaks out. Passengers scream, and there's chaos across the ferry. Unfortunately, most people on board drowned, including the child that made the distress call in the first place. This very upsetting story broke the news, causing everyone to ask many questions. This happened. Is everyone coping fine? And who's responsible for this? At first glance, this looks like a very tragic accident. But the more investigators looked into it, the less it made sense. Some dots were connected and some pivotal information was found. Incompetence from the captain was not the full story. The ferry was actually heavier than it was supposed to be. Someone illegally added more shipping containers to the ferry, and as you can assume, the more cargo on one ferry, the more money the company makes. So when this new information came out to the public, there was noise. Lots of noise.
Yet another
protesting the decision.
People were angry. Somebody put company profits over the safety of women and children. Whoever owns the ferry needs to be held responsible. But who actually owns it? Not long prior to the Sewol ferry incident, President Park was voted to be the leader of South Korea, and one of the key debates at the time was potentially limiting chaebol power. But what investigators noticed is that President Park had some ties with some of the chaebol families, including the owner of the Sewol ferry. This man right here, Yoo Byung-en, leader of one of the most powerful chaebols in South Korea. After the public found this information out, people were not happy. President Park was supposed to be one with the people. She was voted in at the end of the day. South Korea is supposed to be a democracy. But President Park wasn't very vocal on the matter, especially after the talk about limiting chaebol influence, because this wasn't the only time chaebol families had abused their power. In 2014, Korean Air Vice President Heather Cho had an infamous freakout. A flight attendant came to serve her some nuts in a bag instead of a plate. Instead of being an upstanding citizen and politely correcting the flight attendant, Cho stood up, and boy did she have a lot to say. Cho stood up, was freaking out, and made a scene. She then called over the cabin crew chief and made him kneel to ask for forgiveness, humiliating him, then shortly after, firing him. On its own, this story sounds ridiculous. Why did she do that? But to the Korean public, this confirmed something much darker. Suspicions a lot of people had already suspected were true. These people, the chaebol families, genuinely thought they were untouchable, above the law in every way possible. And to an extent, they weren't wrong. After multiple scandals and the chaebols acting like they're above the law, the Korean people started demanding the truth and transparency from the government for allowing chaebol reign to overthrow them. But the most powerful chaebol of them all has some dark scandals that I'm about to uncover. In the months following the Sewol ferry incident and the Korean Air freakout, many candlelight protests were brewing, bigger than you could probably ever imagine. Truth, accountability, and reform was what the people wanted as they marched down the streets in resentment towards the government for being so complacent on the chaebol atrocities, treating the nation like their little toy. Talks about President Park being impeached became a popular topic. Distrust from the government was at an all-time high. But what we know now is that President Park was closer to the chaebol families than we originally thought. Maybe even a bit too close. Not just the safe level of friendship that we originally thought, but instead illegally close to the country's biggest chaebol. Samsung attempted to bribe President Park with a $38 million deal for essentially even more power over the country. If President Park accepts the offer, this gives Samsung even more power than they had before, and this was their plan all along. President Park accepts the offer. But I know what you're probably thinking. Which individual is powerful enough to even give this offer in the first place? Lee Jae-yong, the founder of Samsung's grandson and current owner of Samsung as of 2026. But President Park thought she might get away with this. But the Korean people were loud with their concerns, making President Park the first president in South Korean history to get impeached in 2017. Cheers roar across the country, and President Park was arrested and sentenced to 24 years in prison and fined $17 million. And for Lee Jae-yong, also arrested and sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. President Park was succeeded, and South Korea had a new president. His name was Moon Jae-in, and he vowed to not take the situation lightly and release anyone from prison prematurely. But unfortunately, he might have lied by that statement. Samsung's dominance and influence over the country is like no other. President Moon ended up releasing Lee from prison because he realized something. The economy is too reliant on Samsung, so the country functioning without him is a massive lose-lose situation for everyone. But what a lot of people don't realize is that this is actually a very scary situation for South Korea. This level of power basically means Lee is effectively above the law, along with the other chaebols. If serious acts of fraud and betrayal are just written off, then what else can they get away with? And what makes this worse is the Korean people agree with it, with 77% of Koreans agreeing with the president that they need him. He needed to be released from jail because everyone seems to be in the belief that if Samsung does well, Korea does well. Now, my final question to you is, how long do you think this Samsung chaebol reign will last for? And should it stop? And is this the fall of South Korea as we know it?